You ready? Okay. Good morning and welcome to the February 13th, 2020 meeting of the New York City Campaign Finance Board. The first item on our agenda is the approval of minutes from the January 16th, 2020 meeting. I move their approval. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. The next item on our agenda is the report of the chair. So last month, the board issued the first public funds payment for the special elections for Queens Borough President. Two candidates in the race qualified for a total payment of nearly $975,000. All six of the candidates still in the running for this seat chose to participate in the program under the enhanced 8-to-1 matching ratio for public funds. The next campaign finance disclosure deadline for Queens Borough President will be February 21, and the next public funds payments will follow on February 27. Election day will be March 24, with early voting starting on Saturday, March 14. Another special election for city office was announced last month, this time in Council District 37, following the resignation of Rafael Espinal. The first disclosure statement deadline for candidates in that race also arrives on February 21. Election day for the Council District 37 special election will be April 28, which is also the statewide presidential primary date. Early voting for those contests will begin on Saturday, April 18. CFB staff has relaunched its popular 5-borough tour training sessions. With several changes to the matching funds program now in effect, we are seeing unprecedented interest in running for city office. These training sessions are part of our effort to make the matching funds program more accessible to New Yorkers than ever before. Attendees learn about the program and how to participate in it with confidence. So far, staff has held training sessions in Brooklyn and Queens. A session will be held in the Bronx next week and on Staten Island in March. RSVP by visiting the CFB's website. I now turn to Voter Assistance Advisory Committee Chair Naomi Zauderer for her report.
Thank you, Chair Schaefer. At the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee meeting held last night, we discussed the CFB's plans to help 20,000 naturalized citizens register to vote in 2020. We were joined by some of our partners in this 20K in 2020 initiative, including Dominicanos USA. We discussed strategy for how to achieve this ambitious goal. That starts with the Days of Action events we will hold in March with our community partners in Brooklyn and Queens. We invite community groups who want to join in this important effort to sign up today for our training sessions. Information and the RSVP is available on the CFB's website. Empowering youth voters to participate in elections is another main focus for NYC Votes staff. This week, we kicked off one of our major youth initiatives for 2020 with training sessions for student leaders in all 5 boroughs. We are encouraging these student leaders who attend to host voter registration drives at their schools for Civics Week from March 2nd to March 9th. Students who attend will learn about voting patterns in New York City, voter registration best practices, and how to participate in a Civics Week registration drive at their school. On February 21st, NYC Votes will host a voting summit at CUNY's BMCC campus. The summit will feature speakers, workshops, and breakout sessions on organizing skills, adaptive leadership, issues-based organizing, and voter rights for students and campus leaders. Sign up for all of these events is available on the CFB's website. With all of these exciting programs in the works, we must remember that Queens voters will be selecting their next borough president next month. So a reminder, the CFB will publish a voter guide with information about the candidates running for this office. Watch for news from NYC Votes on social media and your email about the guide in the coming weeks. And with that, I will turn it over to Executive Director Amy Loprest.
Thank you. So the staff at the CFB is busy preparing for the 2021 elections, making sure that we provide the best possible and most accessible experience for candidates. We are gearing up. The first public funds payment for that election will be next December, in less than a year. I also want to remind everyone that tomorrow, Valentine's Day, is the deadline to change your party enrollment or to enroll in a party if you want to vote in the presidential primaries in April. So get that voter registration form in if you want to change your party enrollment.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda are appearances by candidates contesting proposed penalties and/or repayments. The first candidate scheduled to appear is Michelle Faulkner. So if your representative would like to take, you and your representative take the table, and CFB staff will take the table. Let me just briefly describe our exceedingly simple and informal process. The CFB staff will go first, really just to state what the issue is. Then you will have the floor and take some time to set forth your arguments and about the penalties that you're contesting. CFB staff will then have an opportunity to respond. There may or may not be questioning from members of the board. At the end, I'll give you a brief period to sum up if you would like to, and same with the CFB. And then we will go into deliberations after we've heard from the two other candidates and come back after deliberations and announce our result. Okay, so why don't you begin?
Good morning, Chair Schaefer, Executive Director Loprest, members of the board, Mr. Faulkner and Mr. Groberg. My name is Jason Yee, Associate Counsel for the CFB, and with me is Auditor Leandra Flores. Before the board is a matter of the Michael Faulkner campaign in the 2017 elections for controller. Mr. Faulkner was a participant in the program and did not receive public funds. CFB staff recommends that the board find that the campaign committed violations of the Campaign Finance Act and board rules as follows, and assess penalties according to the penalty guidelines. Failing to provide merchant account statements, failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements, accepting over-the-limit contributions, accepting a contribution from an unregistered political committee. The campaign contests the recommended violations and penalties.
Thank you all for the work that you do. And
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
If you could just press the button.
So it's green. Yeah.
There you
Oh,
go.
green.
Yeah.
Green means go.
Yeah.
Okay, I got that. All right. Thank you for the work that you do. I do appreciate it. And now living in another city, I can greatly appreciate the CFB and what it does for democracy and the process here in New York City. When I set out, and I'll keep this very brief. When I set out to run for public office for New York City, I did that as a citizen and fully intended to participate in the matching program. As we started our campaign, we were not able to meet the threshold for contributions for others, and we continued on our campaign. I had no intention of deploying all of my savings, and which I did, and and I did that in the same spirit that the founders did, to pledge their lives and their sacred honor and all their fortunes to a process. And we did make some mistakes along the way, but our intentions were never to defraud or to misrepresent or to break the law, violate the law, because we did attend, we did understand what the stipulations were. And I do believe there are probably a couple of areas which I'll ask Eric to share, in which we kind of disagree with the findings. But for the most part, we felt that the board, the findings were within the boundaries of what you said we were supposed to do and what we didn't do, et cetera. So we're not here to dispute those, and to go through the audit report, et cetera, but only to appeal for a reduction or elimination of fines because of the tremendous amount that has already been put into the campaign, and just my personal position and condition and inability to satisfy those fines at this time. And so I'll do more of that in summary, but I'd like to ask Eric if he could maybe share a couple of the areas where.
Sure. First, just to elaborate on Michael's comments concerning our best intentions, we made every effort to raise sufficient funds to enable us to repay the loans both to Mr. Fisher and to Michael Faulkner. Those efforts ultimately were not successful, partly because of the shift from the mayoral campaign to the controller campaign in May of 2017. We could have totally exited the political arena at that juncture, but we wanted to continue on in order to both complete Michael's mission to serve the city, as well as to complete our financial obligations with respect to the campaign finance board requirements. Secondly, on the smaller items that Michael referred to, item number one, failure to provide TD Bank statements. We did provide the CFB in our response on page 36 and 37, the closure form, closure paperwork for that account, and a document from TD Bank indicating that the account had been closed on the date that we said it was, and therefore we were not able to provide subsequent statements because the statements did not exist. So we would ask that fine be reversed. Secondly, there was a comment in the report about the stripe, that we provided the wrong stripe reports. We provided the reports that our campaign finance liaison and other members of the CFB team provided us in order to complete our record keeping. So I would respectfully disagree with the assertion that we provided stripe reports for a different, that weren't relevant to our campaign. We only had one stripe account. It was the one that the CFB steered us towards when they modified the program during the campaign to make it easier for candidates to process contributions from our supporters. Thank you.
Did you want? You could go on, or you do. Do you want to just respond to this one or two points relating to this proposed penalty?
Sure. So first, I would like to say that the penalty guidelines have a presumption of unintentional noncompliance. CFB staff has no reason to believe that there was any malfeasance or intentional noncompliance on the part of the campaign. That being said, the penalties we've recommended are the standard penalties laid out in the guidelines. Regarding the campaign statements on violation one, the TD bank closure document that Mr. Groberg is referring to is in Exhibit 2 on page 37. As you can see, it doesn't have any TD letterhead. It has no markings. There's nothing on the page that can adequately tell us that this is in fact a closure document from TD Bank, and so it was deemed insufficient. On the subject of the Stripe account, that is not the NYC Votes Contribute Stripe account. There the campaign did provide all the statements for the NYC Votes Contribute Stripe account. However, as stated in the board recommendation, there was a different Stripe account that was disclosed on the campaign's June 12th, 2017 amended certification. That was, we just didn't receive any documents for this. Other than the campaign disclosing that this account existed on that amended certification, we don't know anything about the account.
Would you like to respond to those points?
Well, number one, with respect to TD Bank, I can go back to them and ask them for a more official document to help address that issue. Number two, I don't recall the Stripe reporting issue that you're referring to on June 12th, 2017. So we welcome further clarification of that at the appropriate time.
Of course,
there were no other Stripe accounts that we had at that time. We had the Stripe account that the Campaign Finance Board helped us implement. I believe it was earlier that year. It may have been 2016.
Say again why you thought there was another Stripe account.
The campaign on its June 12th, 2017 amended certification disclosed a Stripe account with ending in different digits than the NYC Votes Contribute Stripe account. And
you don't know anything about that? I mean, is it possible that it was just a typo?
Did they disclose the NYC Votes Contribute Stripe account on their certification?
Yes. So we have, I don't have additional printouts for the board, unfortunately, but we do have a list of all the merchant and bank accounts that the campaign disclosed. And of the 9 accounts, the only account that we really have no information for other than this amended certification disclosure is that Stripe account. And it is not our practice to disclose the actual ending digits for these accounts. However, based on the ending digits, it doesn't seem to be a typo.
Who submitted that disclosure? The same person who's here today?
The campaign, yes. So all these amended certifications need to be signed by the candidate. And
I mean, we're in the weeds here, but then it would be preferable if these kinds of things got sorted out prior to a hearing before the board. So why don't we move on at this point? I don't know what more we can do today. You want to move on to perhaps the second smaller point, or are you just going to go to the big one?
That was it. I think that.
Yeah, there were just 2 points, Chair. The TD Bank issue and the Stripe issue. With respect to Stripe, the only thing I can imagine it relating to is we had a consultant down in Virginia that was helping us raise funds, but that was through an account called Antidote, and we provided all the details associated with those donations. So between those donations and Stripe, I'm not aware of anything beyond that in terms of money coming into the campaign that we didn't report.
But you're the one who would have filed this report, right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
I mean, there were times when my role in the campaign changed, but
as you sit here today, you have no idea what that apparent second Stripe account is.
Correct.
Okay.
For the record, the account that Mr. Groberg is referring to, the Antidote account, was tied to a First Virginia Community Bank account. That, in addition to an American Express account, we resolved those violations. We initially cited them in the penalty notice, and we deemed that those were resolved. So we're talking about a different account here that we simply have no documents regarding.
Okay, let's keep going.
Okay.
Next.
Yeah. we have no other, no other disputes on the details of the violations. It's only my intent at this point to appeal for a waiver or a reduction of fines, simply because of the I'm no longer in the business of politics, and nor do I intend to be ever again in life. I can assure you.
You've learned your lesson.
I have learned my lesson. But these penalties, rightfully assessed, would be arduous, and I could pay for the remainder of my time here on Earth and continue to pay little bit by little bit if that's acceptable. But other than that, I have no resources to add to that. And and to start another fundraising operation to pay off this debt is
Not practical.
not practical.
What are you doing now?
Yeah.
What are you doing now that you've forsaken politics?
I am back in ministry in Philadelphia. I'm the executive director for the Philadelphia Council for Clergy, and I steer clear of politics. So it's I think there's a sidebar. I think what the CFB is doing to get younger voters and to get other voters involved in politics is tremendously important, and it's good work. We need to continue to do that. But when and we just weren't able to meet the threshold. But I think the New York City campaign finance program is probably one of the best in the country. It's unique, and it's important to keep people involved.
Thank you.
All right. Anything further? Excuse me. Anything further from CFB staff?
No, Chair Shaver, that will be all. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We'll let you know after deliberations what our decision is. The next candidate scheduled to appear is Danique Miller.
Yeah. Yeah. We did
I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself in just a minute on the
You
record.
need to turn on the microphone.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you were here to hear the instructions about how we proceed. So I'm going to let the CFB staff go first, just to tee up the issues, and then I'll give you an opportunity to make your appearance and make your argument. So please go ahead, Joe.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Schaefer, members of the board, Executive Director Loprest, Mr. Harrison. I'm Joseph Gallagher, Senior Associate Counsel for the CFB, and I have with me today Anthony Grion, a Senior Auditor at the CFB. Before the board this morning is the matter of the I, Danique Miller campaign in the 2017 primary and general elections for City Council, District 27 in Queens. The campaign was a participant in the program and received public funds. CFB staff recommends that the board find the campaign committed the following 8 violations of the Act and board rules: failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements, failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for receipts, failing to report transactions in daily pre-election disclosure statements, accepting a contribution from a corporation, accepting a contribution from an unregistered political committee, failing to document a transaction, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, and making impermissible post-election expenditures. CFB staff further recommends the board find the campaign must repay public funds. The campaign contests these recommended violations, penalties, and repayment obligation. And I'd just like to say at the outset, I met with Mr. Harrison just prior to the meeting. He did not understand this meeting to be an appearance before the board, but to provide further documentation. I have emails that we exchanged in the last few months about this appearance, and also about there was no opportunity to submit additional documentation at this stage of the enforcement process.
Okay, Mr. Harrison.
Good morning. My name is Maurice Harrison. I'm the treasurer for Danique Miller. but for the 2017 reelection. But I also had an assistant working with me that was responsible for all the input into CXS. I'm not disputing what the board is saying, but would I like some extended time to provide more documentation? Because it would make
What documentation do you have? That
I have the receipts, the timesheets. I have
you have checks?
the bank's check,
You have
the
checks?
cancel check from the bank. I have a whole lot of documentation I like to present. So I think it would make a big difference if it's
Well,
looked over.
I'm sure it would. Can you offer any explanation as to why the campaign did not offer these documents before?
As far as I'm concerned, my assistant was taking care of that. It seems now that evidently she didn't. 'Cause she was supposed to appear here this morning. She didn't show up.
Can I ask a question? Did you bring the documents today, or
Yeah, I
you
did.
want more time to collect more
No,
documents?
I bought them today.
I just want to be clear.
So what you're in effect asking for is an adjournment of the hearing.
Yes, give me another date.
I will just say that the first meeting that we proposed was in November. The campaign was hard to contact and reach about coordinating that appearance. We then moved it to December. That's when I first spoke with Mr. Harrison that the campaign was unable to appear in December. That happened in January, and now this is the meeting, the first that we were able to confirm the appearance of the campaign.
All right. So I think the best thing to do is not spend a lot of time on this, but to take under consideration the request for an adjournment, because you do not appear to be ready to go forward. We've read the memo, and so we know what you're going to say. And really the issue on the table for us is whether to grant an adjournment or not. I must say, this is not a rare occurrence, but it is an unhappy occurrence because the process is set up so that documents are submitted and issues are worked out to the extent that they can be worked out well in advance of a board hearing. It is really inefficient for both the staff time and for the board's time to have these kinds of last minute requests for adjournment and last minute offers of documentation that should have been offered weeks or months before. But we will take under consideration your request for an adjournment, and I think that's probably all we should say or do for today.
My only concern is that from what I saw of what the documentation is, it's just in a bag. So it's not organized in any way. It's not responsive to specific violations or penalties, if I'm not misunderstood. So I would just ask for an adjournment.
Yeah, but one of the troubling things about this, if we ever get to the merits, is the total disconnect between the level of penalties and the amount of the repayment obligation, which is, in my mind, is creating some real issues. So I mean that is something that this is a somewhat unusual case to have penalties that are one level and repayment obligation of in excess of $100,000. To me, it's a very unique set of circumstances.
Right, but I do appreciate your last comment, and so if we grant an adjournment, it will be on condition that you all meet and work out a way of providing the documentation that is responsive to specific categories and requests, so that our staff's time is not wasted sorting through, in effect, a shopping bag of checks, but make sure that you submit them in an organized form that makes what is in effect a continuation of the audit process at least efficient, even if delayed. So we'll take that under advisement. Thank you very much.
Yeah, but they're pretty much organized already. Is there any way you can leave them today or come back in another date?
why don't you and Mr. Gallagher discuss this during our deliberations as to what the most efficient way is, and when, how much time they need to review it, and then perhaps they might need a second meeting with you to sort this out. I mean, look, our goal is always to resolve disputes about violations and penalties, but we hope to do it at a much earlier stage than this. But there are, very significant repayment obligations being proposed here, as well as penalties. So why don't you two talk during our break?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. I
very
appreciate
much.
that. Thank you much.
And the next candidate scheduled to appear is Jorge Vasquez. All right. So I'll ask the CFB staff to go first, and as I always say, tee up the issues for us.
Good morning, Chair Schaefer, Executive Director Loprest, members of the board. My name is Cameron Ferrante. I'm Senior Associate Counsel with the board, and with me today is CFB Senior Auditor Victoria Telt. Before the board is the matter of the Jorge Vasquez campaign in the 2017 election for City Council District 2. The candidate was a participant in the program. CFB staff recommends that the board find that the candidate committed the following violations of the Act and board rules and assess penalties according to the penalty guidelines: failing to file a disclosure statement, failing to report transactions in daily pre-election disclosure statements, accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, making impermissible post-election expenditures. And CFB staff further recommends that the board find the campaign must repay public funds. The campaign is contesting the recommended violations, penalties, and the public funds repayment obligation.
All right. Thank you.
Good morning, Board Schaefer, Director Lopez, and board members. As it relates to failure to properly report, we agree in part and disagree in part. With regards to disagreeing in part, we've provided the documentation and uploaded information properly. So for example, and by way of background, we provided coffee that we purchased from a bodega that we used our debit card for, campaign debit card, reported and said that bodega's transactions just show that a minimum amount of money was spent, but that was something that we routinely did and isn't noted as a qualified expense. We also provided our invoices from Millennial Strategies for $15,682. Subsequently, also provided a subcontractor disclosure where Millennial Strategies notes it doesn't use a subcontractor disclosure, subcontractors. That part isn't noted as a qualified expense. We believe that it should be. In addition to that, we note we submitted a contract from Local Strategies LLC in the amount of $2,000 along with an invoice that also was not included as a qualified expense. Our position is that it should, as it relates to accepting monies from a LLC or a corporation. One of the individuals that we hired noticed that it gave us a discounted rate on software, Hustle software. We subsequently submitted a check in that amount back to them and gave them a copy of that check. So we would ask, based on the initial recommendation that noted, if you return these funds, then we won't penalize you for that. As it relates to post-election violations, those post-election violations are noted for expenses that were purchased but not noted on the bank statement until after the election. So for example, Facebook advertisements that were purchased prior to the election, but Facebook, the way it does with its advertisement, at least it did in 2017, was if I purchased something on, let's say, September 9th, the election is September 12th, until they finish showing however many times they want to show your video or something, they don't actually charge you until after they complete the services. So that delay and those delays associated with Google ads as well as with Facebook are not post-election violations, but really just the way Facebook and Google operate, that if you purchase something, let's say on election day, to try to boost a video, Google would give you that, would accept that money, charge a card, but it would charge it after it shows the videos.
Would you like to respond?
Also, I'm sorry, one last thing.
Go ahead.
We also provided a contract for Chayton Hubbard. As the board probably knows, Chayton Hubbard is now deceased, but in 2017, he was running his own campaign with the Campaign Finance Board. He closed his campaign, noted to the board that he was coming to join our campaign. Our campaign sent the only contract we had with him. We have emails that we've subsequently sent afterwards that memorialize the agreement between us and Chayton Hubbard, as well as provided the front and backs of copies. In sum, we believe we have $20,000 plus of post-campaign expenses that aren't counted as qualified expenses. And to memorialize those again, that's the invoice and the subcontracted agreement from Millennial Strategies of $15,682. Another contract from Localized Strategies, LLC, for $2,000, and continuous expenses paid to Chayton Hubbard that are memorialized in every disclosure we supported, we uploaded, and also provided with the front, back, and transaction numbers on those checks. Thank you.
So I'll try to address these one by one. With respect to the failing to report, the Millennial Strategies expenditures that the candidate referenced weren't failures to report. They were cited both for accepting contributions from a corporate or from a limited liability company. Essentially what happened is one of the principals of Millennial Strategies provided a $1,000 discount on the $2,000 monthly retainer that the campaign was obligated to pay to Millennial Strategies. And the campaign reported that as an in-kind contribution from the principal of Millennial Strategies. However, pursuant to Board Rule 104H, a person and who controls or established an entity is considered a single source with that entity for purposes of establishing compliance with the aggregate contribution limits. So when a person who's a principal of a company gives a $1,000 discount, theoretically, it constitutes a contribution from the entity as well as the person. So that then was treated as a $1,000 in-kind contribution from the corporation. The campaign was given the opportunity to refund that contribution either by paying that amount to Millennial Strategies or to the public fund. In response to the enforcement notice, they paid it to the public fund. However, because they'd previously been informed of the violation and that it was being treated as a corporate contribution and it failed to refund it within the time granted by the CFB, they're still subject to a penalty under the penalty guidelines for essentially an untimely refund of a corporate contribution.
What was the deadline for the refund, and what was the date of the refund?
The deadline for the refund would have been the due date for the DAR response. I don't believe I have it in front of me.
How late was the repayment?
The enforcement notice response came in almost a year after the deadline to respond to the DAR, so it was a substantial gap in the time period.
Am I right, though? I know that's the violation, but I'm focusing on the qualified expenditure point.
So
could you get to that?
I can address that too. So there's also an issue with a qualified expenditure for two Millennial Strategies. Essentially, the campaign paid Millennial Strategies, what was it, $15,682 for purportedly for GeoTV services, Get Out the Vote, and field canvassing. And in support of that, they provided, in response to the DAR, in response to the IDR, they provided a check showing that they'd paid that expenditure to Millennial Strategies. And in response to the enforcement notice, they provided an invoice. However, the invoice is insufficiently detailed, essentially. It's exhibit 6, I believe, to the board memo. And, oh, sorry, not Exhibit 6.
It's 5, right?
No, Exhibit 5 is the contract with Millennial Strategies.
I do have a
copies of it
copy
here.
if I could give you.
Would you like to see copies, or
Is the contract Exhibit 5?
this is the invoice from Millennial Strategies?
Oh, it's
for-
not, the invoice isn't part of the
No.
exhibits. Okay, yes.
And this is to hire individual people to work on the campaign?
That's what we believe. So.
I have a copy. Thank you.
So
So as you can see from the invoice, it lists GeoTV services, but it's not really sufficiently detailed to document the expenditure itself. What we'd need to see would essentially be timesheets and the underlying documentation for the expenditure to prove that the services
but the campaign
were actually rendered.
The campaign did pay this amount.
The campaign did pay this amount. We're not disputing that that the expenditure was made to Millennial Strategies. We're just questioning the sufficiency of the underlying documentation.
Yeah, the
To show that it's a
documentation
qualified
required when people pay, when you hire a consultant to pay individual workers, is the same level of documentation you would hire if you would require if you hired those individual people themselves. So, a timesheet showing that this $15,682 was paid to, whatever, we don't even know how many people, maybe 10, maybe 100 people were paid $150 each, what their timesheet is and what the work that they did. And that's required, clearly in our training and in the handbook that kind of documentation for individual services is required.
There's no penalty for that. This is
No,
just whether
this is
it's
just a
not
document.
This is just a non-qualified, and it's solely
Yeah.
committee liability as well.
So this relates to the qualified expenditure deficit.
Yes.
Now, if this was qualified, the deficit would go away.
Yes, that's correct.
This deficit is what, 4,000?
Deficit's approximately $4,566, I believe, and this expenditure is
Essentially-
substantially larger than that. Yes.
Okay.
But again, we're lacking the underlying documentation
And
that
there
we
there
would.
was some other
Yeah. So
and were qualified.
I can move on. The campaign, sorry, then the next thing I believe was mentioned was the expenditure to, this is similarly in the public funds repayment obligation, the expenditure to Localized Strategies LLC, which is, I believe, Ryan Hughes. Yeah. So the campaign provided a contract for this expenditure. It's a $2,000 expenditure. The contract itself is essentially just boilerplate and was deemed insufficiently detailed to document the expenditure to
Was there,
Mr.
was
Hughes,
there a
excuse me.
payment?
There was a payment, and I believe we do have documentation of the payment. It's
2,000.
essentially a similar situation to Millennial Strategies, except in lieu of an invoice, we have a contract. After that, the candidate referenced Chetan Hubbard. With respect to that, we do have copies of the checks used to pay Mr. Hubbard for the reported expenditures. However, the candidate referenced a contract that was provided. We have no copies of a formal contract with Mr. Hubbard. All we have are an email exchange that was provided in response to the enforcement notice, which is not considered a contract or sufficiently detailed to essentially take the place of a contract for
Which is the
purposes of
Hubbard?
the audit. Sorry?
How much was the Hubbard?
The Hubbard? Oh, $31.50 in total.
And what do the emails say in terms of the purpose of the expenditure?
Copies of the email also that I can provide. Oops, sorry.
I do. Thank you.
So the email is essentially a conversation between Mr. Hubbard and the candidate in which Mr. Hubbard says that there's a range of services he'd be willing to provide and lays out an amount that he'd be willing to be paid. Later on, Mr. Vasquez essentially agrees and references a formal signed proposal, references a signed proposal. And then Mr. Hubbard agrees to that, but we don't have any copies of the signed proposal or of the contract that Mr. Vasquez references in an email to his attorney, Anthony Vargas.
I'll
That's
ask a
also
law
within the
school question.
exchange. It is a law school question.
I'll ask a law school question. If Mr. Vasquez, based on this email, if Mr. Hubbard had said, "You owe me the money," would he have been able to enforce this as a contract?
So I would say, in response to a law school question, that this could be considered a contract. However, the contract itself would not be sufficiently detailed to constitute documentation for purposes of making the expenditures qualified.
Why is that? What more detail would be required?
We'd like to see a term of service. We'd like to see actual duties or services provided laid out here. Essentially, this is an offer that includes a full spectrum of services. It's unclear which we're actually contracted for or what the services were that Mr. Hubbard was providing.
And do our rules or guidance or training programs lay out that requirement for detail?
Yes, contracts are required to be detailed, including such things like terms of service and the services that will be provided.
And we provide samples of such.
Sorry?
Provide
Oh, yeah.
samples.
Oh, yes. We provide samples to the candidates of such contracts.
Anything else you'd like to respond to?
I believe I've addressed pretty much everything.
Can you just, I know it was not addressed in the notice, but Mr. Vasquez mentioned it here. It's the Facebook and.
The impermissible post. Yes. So the impermissible post-election expenditures, it may well be that the services provided by Facebook and Google were pre-election. However, the campaign hasn't provided us with any documentation showing that it relates to pre-election services, like an invoice.
There's no penalty for that.
Sorry?
You're not proposing any penalty.
I'm not proposing
for
a
that.
penalty. No, this is a violation, no penalty proposal. But we just don't have documentation showing that the services were for pre-election, or that the expenditures were for pre-election services.
Okay. Anything further that you'd like to address?
Yes, our position is we did submit a contract memorializing, as the email says, we provided that to Campaign Finance Board. Unfortunately, we didn't have an extra copy of that, or we didn't take a copy of that, and we only submitted our only copy as it relates to Mr. Hubbard. I would ask, since Mr. Hubbard is deceased, and that since we have this email memorializing that, coupled with the front and back of payments totaling $3,150, in addition to Mr. Hubbard himself once being a candidate and expressing to CFB he was dismissing his candidacy to join our campaign and join the campaign for the position noted in that email, that these payments, namely $3,150, be considered qualified expenditures. As it relates to Mr. Hughes, this, I believe, is more than a boilerplate. I think this contract is aligned with the kind of contracts that Director Lopres mentioned with CFB. It notes who the services are between, and it notes what kind of services are going to be provided. It notes a term, and notes the performances. This isn't simply, this contract itself has 31 paragraphs to it. This isn't the same as the email. And for that reason, I would ask that this also be counted as a qualified expense.
Let me just stop you there for a second. What exhibit do we have that
I don't believe
contract?
it's not here. So I'll give you the copy and then I'll start rationale.
Okay, well, I'm going to let Mr. Vasquez finish first. But thank you for providing that to us.
As it relates to the Millennial Strategy invoice, this is the first time we're receiving a notice that it wasn't sufficient enough. What we were told is that we needed to respond back with a subcontractor agreement. We responded back with a subcontractor disclosure signed by Alex Vocek, noting that he did not use subcontractors. So the fact of it wasn't Millennial Strategy, let's say, hiring individuals that would then trigger the same kind of response as if the campaign directly hired individuals. Here you have the organization noting, no, we didn't hire subcontractors. As it relates to GOT field operation, as you all know, field operation includes much more than just canvassers. It includes individuals who are doing your cut sheets. It includes individuals who are using different algorithms and different materials that allow you to provide an adequate GOTV campaign. And then finally, I would just like to add that between Millennial Strategies, the payment to Ryan Hughes, which a contract was provided for, and the payments to Mr. Hubbard, we're over $21,000 of what seems to be otherwise qualified expenditures.
Okay, back to you.
Thanks. So with respect to the contract with Mr. Hughes, I agree that it is long and has numerous paragraphs. However, the only portion that appears relevant to the services or descriptive of the services provided is in paragraph 1, which just says that Mr. Hughes will provide general consulting, field strategy, and get out the vote management. And there's no other reference to what that entails or the types of certain, like anywhere else within the contract. The rest of it is simply just boilerplate things, including,
Was there an invoice or timesheets or other evidence provided later on to show what the services were?
I don't believe so. I believe there was just a $2,000 payment.
No, we provided an invoice for $2,000, and it was after we provided the invoice along with the contract that we were told, we're missing the contract. Can you please provide the contract? Subsequently, we provided the contract. I do have a copy of the invoice. The invoice notes GOTV Consulting.
My understanding is that the invoice essentially says the same thing: GOTV Consulting, field strategy, and get out the vote management. Doesn't go into any more detail. And as the candidate mentioned, with respect to Millennial Strategies, get out the vote operations entail much more than just a get out the vote operation. There's a lot of sub-responsibilities and activities that could easily have been laid out in an invoice, which would then probably have allowed us to more easily assess the services provided.
How much is this Ryan Hughes? How much is the total for
$2,000.
Flat fee.
Okay.
Yes.
Also, these services overlap with the GOTV operations provided by Millennial Strategies, so they're duplicative as well.
If I may respond to that, they're totally not. They're totally not, for the simple fact that we have candidates who have multiple campaign managers. They have deputy campaign managers. Their overlap, yes, but they could be towards different sections. As you all know, New York City District 2 is an extremely diverse district with over 100,000 registered Democrats. To think that one person alone would be able to do GOTV or supervise one component of GOTV would be strange at best. Also, to the extent that this was not sufficient, that was not ever noted to the campaign.
I mean, that's absolutely true. And I guess that's why we asked for more detailed documentation. You know, what you say is exactly true, and more detailed documentation would show that. I guess my question is that on related to Millennial Strategies, the expenditure sample report, you're right, there was a separate question about subcontractors, which is different than the qualified expenditures. It seems fairly clear that the code associated with that not accepted expenditure for Millennial Strategies indicates that you did not provide I mean, it says the campaign must provide a complete set of contemporaneous timesheets for the workers hired by the consultant vendor and the signature of both parties.
So, if I may, the prior expenditure sample reports provided to the campaign only listed the code requesting an invoice from the campaign, essentially because we hadn't received invoices relating to those services. Once we'd received the invoices, we were then able to determine that they were not sufficiently detailed. So the I code is no longer reflected in the expenditure sample report. Now it's a CA undercode, which, as you said, is requesting additionally detailed documentation, which is, I agree, the campaign was never specifically asked for the underlying timesheets, but that's because we had no reason to believe that, or without access to the invoice, there's no way to ask them for that documentation as well.
Do you know whether there were timesheets?
I'm unsure if they were timesheets or not. I know that I'm going to say no in the sense that I don't have any, and that when I reached out to Millennial Strategies, they confirmed that they didn't use any subcontractors. They were paying their own employees to do the work. So it's a little different than what I would imagine the normal process would be, or perhaps a little different than what a normal process would be.
Although even with your own employees, you would not be extraordinary to require timesheets.
Right. I to answer your question, I assume Millennial Strategy does have timesheets of their employees.
But the campaign was not asked for the timesheets?
We asked for the invoice because that's the documentation we believed would be sufficient to demonstrate that the services were provided. But once we received the invoice, we realized it was not sufficient and we needed additional documentation. However, the campaign was asked for the invoice throughout the audit process and only provided it in response to, I believe, the enforcement notice. So we were then unable to, essentially, there's no additional opportunity for the campaign to remedy it.
Now I'm a little confused. We got the invoice. Did we, at any point, did we make a subsequent request for timesheets?
Well, because of the late date of the invoice being provided to us, there's essentially no extra step in the enforcement process.
I'm sorry, I forget.
In response to the enforcement notice.
In response to the enforcement notice.
I'm sorry if I may. Our actual position is we've provided multiple copies of the same invoice, and our position is we certainly provided this invoice closer to the campaign than the last time we provided a copy of this invoice.
The campaign was also given additional time after responding to the enforcement notice to obtain more documentation to hopefully address issues.
Did we ask them, but I'm going back to the question, but did we ask them specifically for timesheets?
At that time, I don't believe we did.
That was the question.
Okay.
All right. Anything further?
No, just based on the totality of this information, coupled with the admission that the campaign wasn't asked to submit copies of these timesheets, that these expenditures be considered qualified, or certainly a percentage of over $21,000 be considered qualified expenditures.
All right. So we'll consider your arguments, and we're going to go into deliberations now, and we'll be back in a little while. Thank you.
Are we still waiting? Is Joe going to come back with that guy?
Nor.
Hillary, is Joe coming back? I just sent an email to the whole staff, but are they?
Right, so after deliberations, we're going to propose and then vote on the following findings with respect to violations, penalties, repayments, and in one case, actually further payment. This includes candidates who did not appear today, as well as those who did. So we're going to go through it in the order that we have it in. It may not be always the same order that people appeared. So stay with us till the end. Okay, first, candidate Michael Faulkner, candidate for the office of Controller in 2017. The board finds the following violations and proposes the following penalties. 1, failing to provide merchant account statements. The board finds a violation, but no penalty. 2, failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements. Board finds a violation and proposes a penalty of $146. 3, accepting over the limit contributions. The board finds a violation and proposes a penalty of $5,000. 4, accepting a contribution from an unregistered political committee. The board finds a violation and proposes a penalty of $3,000 for total penalties of $8,146. Next, Rachel Honig, a candidate for City Council District Number 4 in 2017. The board finds that we owe a payment to candidate Honig of $1,821. Next, Letitia James, a candidate for public advocate in 2017. The board finds the following violations and proposes the following penalties and public funds repayment. 1, failing to document transactions, $100. 2, failing to demonstrate compliance with intermediary reporting and documentation requirements, a penalty of $600 for total penalties of $700, plus a public funds repayment of $18,157.61 for total penalties and repayments of $18,857.61. Next, Melinda Katz, 2017 candidate for Queensborough President. The board finds the following violations and proposes the following penalties and public funds repayment. 1, failing to document transactions, $614. 2, failing to demonstrate compliance with intermediary reporting and documentation requirements, $200. 3, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, $128. 4, making impermissible post-election expenditures, a violation but no penalty, for total penalties of $942. In addition, a public funds repayment of $135,823.57 for total penalties plus public funds repayment of $136,765.57. Next, Danique Miller. The board grants Mr. Miller's request for an adjournment on the following conditions: that he submit the documentations that have been previously requested in the form that complies with the board's rules and reasonable requests of staff within 1 week, and that if there are any follow-up requests or questions, that he respond to those within 1 week after they are made. Next, candidate, I should have said that Mr. Miller was a candidate for City Council District 27. Next, Hiram Montserrat, a candidate for City Council District 21. The board finds the following violations and proposes the following penalties. 1, failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements, $818. 2, failing to report transactions in daily pre-election disclosure statements, $250. 3, failing to report and document basic campaign functions or activities, $500. 4, failing to document transactions, $200. 5, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, $407. 6, exceeding the expenditure limit, $24,248. 7, filing a late response to the initial documentation request, $50, for total penalties of $27,473. Finally, Jorge Vasquez, a candidate for City Council District 2. The board finds the following violations and proposed penalties and repayments. 1, failing to file a disclosure statement, $750. 2, failing to report transactions in daily pre-election disclosure statements, $250. 3, accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, $250. 4, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, violation but no penalty. 5, making impermissible post-election expenditures, violation but no penalty, for total penalties of $1,250, and the board finds no public funds repayment obligation. So the total for Mr. Vasquez is penalties of $1,250.
Mr. Chairman, just to the extent on those repayment obligations from those candidates where it was based on the final bank balance, may it also be understood that it's the number you read or final bank balance as agreed to by the Campaign Finance Board?
Yes, thank you for that correction. Very well. I'll move that those findings, penalties, and repayments or payments be approved. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. We have a few more items that we'll try to get through quickly now. The first is with respect to some complaints filed with respect to candidate Montserrat's 2017 campaign. After investigation, the board has recommended, and I will move the dismissal of those complaints. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. Next, there was a previous special election public funds, actually two, right?
Just
Why-
one.
why-
Okay.
Why don't you do this one?
The staff is requesting that the board ratify the decision of the chair to issue public funds payments for the 2020 special election for Queensborough president. These payments were issued on January 30th to candidate Costas Constantinides, $476,697, and to candidate Elizabeth Crowley, $497,795.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Do I vote or do I abstain on my own?
You can vote on your
I
own
can-
decision.
Okay. Aye. All those opposed, abstentions, motion carries. Next, there was a Rule 709 petition from a candidate, Elizabeth Crowley, who is a current candidate for Queensborough president. The petition involved a request for additional payments based on proof of further qualifying expenditures. The board, and I'm going to make a motion that we dismiss that petition, but this is obviously without prejudice for candidate Crowley to get those payments as part of the next disclosure cycle. In other words, the decision not to make those payments in the last cycle we believe was correct, but further new evidence has been proposed showing qualified expenditures that would appear to entitle her to some additional payments, and she is free to request those additional payments in the next cycle. So with that understanding, I'm going to move to dismiss that petition. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. And finally, we need to consider the vote on the rules for public comment.
Our general counsel is going to
And,
outline what's included in those proposed rules.
As is sometimes the case, I need help from our general counsel. So thank you.
Good morning. I think it's still morning. My name is Hillary Wiseman. I am the general counsel of the New York City Campaign Finance Board. Today, the board will vote on proposed amendments to the board rules regarding public funds payments and repayments, proof of compliance with the Conflicts of Interest Board, deadlines for submitting certain documents and completing compliance trainings, disclosure statements, contribution limits, transfers of funds, qualified expenditures, independent expenditures, expenditures in special elections, disclosure in runoff elections, and the voter guide. These amendments are being made to conform to and facilitate implementation of and compliance with amendments made to the Administrative Code of the City of New York and the New York City Charter by Local Laws Number 1 and 128 for the year 2019, amendments made to the Charter by the 2018 and 2019 Charter Revision Commissions, and amendments made to the New York State Election Law by Section 14 of Chapter 5 of the Laws of 2019 and Section 8 of Chapter 6 of the Laws of 2019. Pursuant to Section 1043 of the New York City Charter, the proposed rules will be published in the city record, and after a 30-day public comment period, the board will hold a public hearing for anyone who wishes to testify. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll move that we approve the rules for public comment. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The motion carries. And the last item is a motion to repair for executive session. We do not have any business in executive session that requires us to reconvene, and therefore I will combine it with a motion to adjourn. A second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Then thank you very much. Our meeting is over.
Over.